Good evening, friends and gentle beings. Today is Friday, October the 6th, and today I wanted to make a small podcast in English again, because the topic is Star Trek Discovery, the new series. Now, I was considering making it in German, because I can speak better and easier in German, since it is naturally my native language. But then I thought that the number of people who had seen Star Trek Discovery in Germany would probably be so low that, I don't know, speaking to those 5 people would not make really much sense. And so I'm sorry to plague your ears again with my horrible English. I try as good as I can. But I wanted to say and contribute something to the ongoing debate especially among Star Trek fans, to which I count myself just sane, about Star Trek Discovery, and also taking a peek on the, shall we say, competing series from Seth MacFarlane called the Orville. Now, spoiler alert ahead, I will not spoil the entire going on of the story, but I may explain anything that happens. So if you don't want to be spoiled for the first 2 episodes of the Orville and the first 3 episodes of Star Trek Discovery, please stop listening now. I will refer to events happening and things ongoing on Star Trek Discovery, the first 3 episodes, and the Orville, the first 2 episodes, which is as far as I've seen Orville, and which is as far as Star Trek Discovery exists as of today. So that said, let's continue with this. I have watched quite a lot of videos about Star Trek Discovery, and the reactions which I have seen are almost overwhelmingly, I would say, or mostly overwhelmingly negative. Now, this may be random or coincidental. I can't say whether this is the general consensus among Star Trek fans. It's really difficult to say, but I remember that only one of the videos which I saw was in the halfway positive towards the first 2 episodes. Some critique was Trek Yards, the great and really wonderful YouTube channel for which are, as the name says, for Trekkies, for Star Trek fans, which I regularly watch. So Trek Yards is really Trek Yards. is really a wonderful YouTube channel if you are interested in anything Star Trek, and the 2 people hosting the series are really quite charming. And Captain Foley, who is one of the older 2 of the duo, was a bit skeptical towards the first 2 episodes, which I can understand and which I go into, and was very enthusiastic now about the 3rd. So I'm really having a hard time to say where the Star Trek community is heading with this. And as I said, my initial impression was that a lot of people were mostly negative about this. Not going to say how representative that impression was, however. Now, my first impression on Star Trek Discovery, watching the first 2 episodes, were extremely skeptical. Because there are some elements of Star Trek Discovery which I still haven't wrapped my mind around whether I'm going to find them more positive or more negative. Now, the reality is that Star Trek, the franchise, has not had a TV series for a good number of years. I'm not entirely sure when the series Enterprise ended, maybe some 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I really don't know for sure, but something along those lines, I assume. But given that Enterprise was not a very successful series, the last big series which counts as a classic great success was Star Trek Voyager, which was really quite some years ago. Again, I'm not going to look up how many years. So Star Trek was not existing as a successful TV series for a good numbers of years. And as we all know who love Star Trek since the early times, the first Star Trek series which I really was getting into was Next Generation, because while Star Trek, the original series, were existing in my childhood already, they were not very popular in German TV at the time. So it was only later on that I was catching up to Star Trek, the original series, of which my favorite series are clearly the original series and then Star Trek Next Generation, while I also loved Deep Space Nine, especially after season 3 or 4. The first 2 or 3 seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine are not so good, but that's a problem that was similar with Star Trek Next Generation. The first episodes, the first season, the early part of the Star Trek Next Generation series was also, if you watch it today, it's the weakest part is always the beginning. I don't remember clearly my initial reaction to Star Trek Voyager, but I never got a fan of Voyager 4. I can't say I never really felt connected to the characters. While it was an interesting setting and got quite interesting later on, I never felt at home with the Star Trek Voyager characters, which is a little bit an individual question. For some people, they like Chakotay or Janeway or Tuvok and all the characters. For me, they were more lukewarm characters, while I really loved the original series characters, the Next Generation characters, and the Deep Space Nine characters were really fascinating and interesting. Now, that given as a background, the first 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery are essentially like a prequel to the series. And it would have been better to call it something like that, to know, okay, this is not the Star Trek episode 1 and 2 of Discovery, but say Star Trek episode of Discovery episode 0, or Star Trek Discovery the prequel, or something like that, because the name-giving ship does not appear in the first 2 episodes, and the other thing is, which is really unusual, is there is now a main character, which is, oh god, names. Those names I really haven't gotten into my mind. The only thing I remember is that the black female main character is called Michael, which is really remarkable given that Michael is actually a male name. And the funny thing is, in episode 3, they even make a joke about this, because in episode 3, this character, Michael, whatever her name is coming to the Discovery in episode 3, which is the first time you see the Discovery, which is really odd that you have 2 full long episodes where the name-giving ship, the Discovery, does not exist. And this Michael, whatever her name is serving on a ship with an unspeakable Klingon name. And that ship, in the end of the story, spoiler alert, is going to be destroyed. And at first it seems that all people but her on the ship may be dead, but it later is found out that some people of this catastrophe survived of this situation. Now, problematic development is that you have a character who essentially is a criminal, this Michael, and she is now getting sort of a second chance in episode 3, starting on the ship Discovery. And the problem is, for me, or the strange thing, shall I say, is you now suddenly have a main character. And that was never the goal of Star Trek. The premise of Star Trek was always the focus on a team. While Captain Sisko, Commander Sisko, Captain Picard, and certainly Captain Kirk were very important characters as the lead character of the ship, as the captains, or the commander of the space station in the case of Deep Space Nine, and also, of course, Captain Janeway. They never were the sole focus or the main focus. While with Star Trek Discovery, they already said before developing it that, how was the wording? I think they said, this time we're not going to show it through the eyes of the captain, but through the eyes of the first officer. The number 1. And I thought that's a weird sentence to say about a Star Trek series, because I never felt that Star Trek, the original series, was through the eyes of Kirk, or that Kirk was the main character, or Picard was the main character, or that the ongoings of Star Trek Next Generation were through the eyes of Captain Picard. As important as the main cast, there was always the team view. Sometimes you had episodes which were focused on one character, on Commander Data, or on a story around Picard, and I don't know, him accompanying with Wesley in one episode. So sometimes they were focused on one or two characters, but the entire series were never through the lens of one character only, which is a really untrackish thing to do. And the main problem I have with the series Star Trek Discovery is that it does not feel, at least as of now, as a Star Trek series. But the problem has many levels. Now, there are a lot of people I know on YouTube and otherwise who say that Seth MacFarlane's Star Trek parody, called the Orville, is the actual Star Trek series as Star Trek is supposed to be. And I have a number of problems with that premise. For one thing, I absolutely don't like the Seth MacFarlane humor. It's totally not my thing. I mean, if you love the humor of Seth MacFarlane, it's all great for you. I don't. I find his humor either immature or in most cases simply boring. It's not something... I remember having watched the first episode of the Orville, and I literally did not laugh a single moment. It's a little bit like, I don't know, some college humor or teenager humor. So it's, I don't know, maybe I'm too serious a person, but I really did not find it funny. Now, the Orville from Seth MacFarlane is not a pure comedy series. There are serious, normal storytelling moments, but somehow the problem with the Orville I have is it is very much like Star Trek Next Generation. The optics, the storytelling, even the way that people, I don't know, look out of a starship window and some epic music plays while they look, is so much like a continuation of Star Trek Next Generation. And you really see that the people making the Orville series loved the 1980s and 90s and that a little bit kitschy style of 1980s, 1990s TV series. And while I often say that I miss the time and I miss the optimistic spirit of this time, especially of TV from this time, and I have so often complained, and I stand to that statement, that the bleak, grey, dark, grim TV series of the present, like Game of Thrones, with all the horror and negativity, or like the version of Galactica, which came, I don't know, 10 years ago or something along that line, I'm not sure, I just followed it from the sidelines. But this bringing of always everything is grey, everything is dark, everything is evil, everything is full of despair and gloom, and this sort of modern TV style and movie style is really absolutely not my thing. And I totally miss something like giving people hope, like giving people inspiration that the future can be good. And this was what Star Trek was supposed to embody, and I think should embody even today. That said, I do not think that we can just return to the TV style of 1985. And that is basically what Seth MacFarlane with the Orville does. He reanimates the TV style of 1985. And I'm sorry to say that's just not interesting for me in 2017. There are styles to make films, to make movies, to make TV from the past, which made great TV series, which made great movies, but you can't just repeat them. Especially something like the typical 1980s, which has a little naivety, shall we say. So if we look at the world through the eyes of today with all the problems we see in the world, and contrast it with the optimism and the cheerfulness and the, shall we say, in a way, the people were also more naive and more optimistic in the 1980s. And it reflected the easygoing mentality of the time. But making such a thing one-on-one in 2017 as a serious series would be absolutely anachronistic and would not really work, save as a parody. So I cannot see the Orville as a replacement. And after watching the first 2 episodes of the Orville, I must admit that I was so bored. Or was this the first 3 even? I think the first 3. After watching the first 3 episodes of the Orville, I was so bored. I was always looking, okay, let's give it a chance. And there is that nostalgia. There is the moment when they stand in front of a window and looking out, and there is a epic Star Trek-ish music or their fire. I don't know, their weapons are not called phasers and torpedoes, they are called something else. All these moments which sound and feel and look like the old Star Trek. It is like wearing your old leather jacket, which you always loved. But the problem is, if you are, I don't know, like myself in your 40s and you wear your old leather jackets from the day when you were 20, there comes a point when this is laughable and not anymore, and it doesn't really work anymore, or it shouldn't work for you anymore. And I feel that I want a certain optimistic look. I want a return of optimism, of giving hope. But we can't just rewind the clock to 1985. We can't just go back and make it all the way it was done. That would be as ridiculous as if we would make the Star Trek, as if the Star Trek developers of 1985 would have made the Star Trek Next Generation in the style of the 60s. That style was obsolete. That way of storytelling was obsolete, and many things they had to forward. So I am for change, for progress, for adapting to the spirit of the time, which the Orville does not. The Orville just steps back in the well-familiar way to make Star Trek like it was 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. And for me, that is just a way too simplistic and childish way to make a series to be really of interest. I'm not saying it's bad, it is technically well made, but it's not really of interest to me. Now, the thing with back to Star Trek Discovery, I am not sure how well they will be able to bring other people of the crew into the fold. So far, looking at episode 3, I was very skeptical with episodes 1 and 2 because there are some things going on which are so anti-Trek. Like the second officer, this number 1, this Michael character, is Vulcan nerve pinching her captain. And then the Vulcans say, oh, you must fire first at the Klingons, which is breaking so many law elements of Star Trek. Like the Vulcans have always been portrayed as the uber pacifist, those who would really let them kill by the hundreds, then break their pacifistic ideal. And being pacifists was one of the core elements of the Vulcan teaching of Zurak. And breaking that is really one of the things which is such a gross and ridiculous break of elements of the law. Now the point is, I can accept that some ideas of the original story are changed. That is not that I am generally against it, that I generally say everything has to be in the law, in the story as it was before. Because let's admit it, Star Trek has always made some changes. But they've never made a revolution, a total breakdown of things. But they, most of the time, have tried to carefully change things. And there were some great changes. Like, for instance, one of the things which I changed now again is the look of the Klingons. Now, I've never been a great fan of the Klingons, but I know there are a lot of big fans of the Klingon culture. And the Klingons are probably the fandom number 1 within Star Trek. And they have a very distinct look, with the hair and the clothing they wear, their armor and other stuff, especially the heads, the faces and the hair. And they've completely reworked those Klingons, and they said or hinted that there may be an explanation for that in the end it makes sense. So I'm not going to make a final judgment about that. So maybe it is really that the Klingons we know are maybe that in some way the universe alters in some way at the end of the Discovery story, or in the course of the Discovery story, or the reality already was entered and we're living practically in a parallel timeline of an altered reality without knowing, so that maybe something happened that changed this timeline and the protagonists just don't know yet, and we the viewers don't know it yet. So this entire militaristic look of Starfleet, this militaristic behavior of Starfleet, the surprising militaristic advice from a Vulcan like Sarek, all these elements of change, the changed look of the Vulcan, maybe some big event happened in the past through time travel of someone altering the past, and maybe they lived. It's just one theoretical explanation, because they said it will make sense. And I can think of a possible number of scenarios where it makes sense. And this is one possible explanation, so I will wait and withhold my judgment until the series is over what I say about the change of the Klingons. In itself, I don't like the change at all, because the Klingons as we knew them since the 1980s had this distinct look, and it was an established look. Now the Klingons had looked like, I think, like Asian humans or Mongolian humans or something along that line in the original series of the 1960s. And this had simple reasons, because they had not the money and not the technical ability for really elaborate changes in the facial structure. So all they could do was do a little face paint, have a little beard and a funny uniform. And so it is understandable that while technology and monetary support advanced in the 1980s, they made the Klingons, remade them in the way that we learned to know them over the long years. But now there is no such reason to make such a change. The Klingons are well accepted and they look, I thought, distinct enough to remain like that. I do not see any reason why they should be changed to look so more alien than they looked before. I do not think that the story or the idea or the setup in any way is advanced. And there is a second thing that really annoys me a lot, especially in the first two episodes. There were lengthy scenes where the Klingons were speaking, and they were the entire time speaking in Klingonese language with subtitles. And this is so strenuous, especially given that the characters who speak Klingon speak it in a really strange way, which was not very pleasant to follow. Usually when Klingons speak among themselves in the original, not in the original, in the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and in Voyager and other, or aliens per se, were speaking in their alien languages, you were hearing their own language for a few seconds, and then they were going over to speaking just English. And you knew, okay, they're speaking among themselves their language. If you have a scene like on Kronos, the capital planet, the main planet of the Klingons, and there were, of course, you knew there were only Klingons, and you knew everyone was speaking Klingonese in this scene, but they were speaking English, of course, for the convenience of the viewer. And this thing to always make them speak in Klingonese with subtitles was so strenuous and so pointless, which is some of the details where they really changed things just to make them different. Like they have again brought in lens flares from the J.J. Abrams style, which I found entirely superfluous. I don't know why people think there must be lens flares. They're just irritating me. They're not over much done there, but they exist, and I don't like the lens flares at all. And there is a second thing, which is really a strange thing, which I just realized after looking at it for a while, is that they often have really strange camera angles. Like the camera is tilted to the left or to the right or a little bit off center, just to give it a strange, non-traditional impression. And this makes an unrest, an uncenteredness of the entire feeling of watching it, which I really find irritating and really getting on my nerves. Now the point with the one character like this number one, Michael, this black woman, which is the main character, which is, as I said, unusual. there seems to be, as we see in episode 3, which I say, why I say they should have started with episode 3 and then maybe in flashbacks told about the past. Because with 3, the series really kicks off much better. Trek has said that, and I fully agree with that. Now, you can still say that's not a typical Trek series, and that is a valid critique. But what they tried something special here, which I can so far appreciate, and I will see where it goes to. They said that is a secret. There is something that it has an element of the X-Files. There is an unknown mystery, an unknown dark secret, which we have hints towards in episode 3. And it does make a sense, which you say, okay, there is this character, which is a former felon, a criminal, actually should never, this Michael, this number 1, which should never have come to Starfleet back, but for reasons you have to watch yourself, she got another chance to get to Starfleet, to work in Starfleet now at the Starship Discovery, and there is something going on there, something dark and sinister. And some people have made series. I have my own series, which I will not put out right now, so not to spoil if it's probably too. But there are possible series. If you are well versed in the Star Trek universe, you may have come to that conclusion, of course, yourself, that it may have something to do with, let's say, an organization with a dark secret in the Federation. And maybe that is the background story, that they are doing something sinister and a great plot, a great conspiracy is going on, which she, the main character, the number 1, Michael, this woman, is gradually revealing. So they put her into the position of not knowing what's going on, like we, the people who watch the series, and so like she discovers these dark ongoings, so gradually with her we do. And if that is the plot, it absolutely makes sense that there is one character which is the main focus through which you perceive the story. Now, the problem of doing that is not that I'm not generally against it. So far, it looks like an interesting series. As I said, they should have absolutely made episode 3, episode 1, because that prequel story is really convoluted in several aspects. Now, I can understand that they do that, even with all the dark and grim settings, if they have in mind what I assume they have in mind. But the problem is we have not had a regular Star Trek series for such a long time that they could have made this weirdo Star Trek variant if we had a normal, shall we call it, fallback Star Trek series. If there was a regular Star Trek series, which could also have been more dark than the cheery 1980s, which would also have a conflict, like Deep Space Nine or like Babylon 5, for instance. There could be this mix of hope and conflict, which, as I said, take, for instance, Babylon 5, which was a really wonderful series, which was exactly between those extremes, that it was cheering you up, giving you hope, giving you reasons to laugh, and on the other side, having a real dramatic story going on and a really challenging problem evolving over the time. And one of the things I really dislike about especially the first 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery and also episode 3 is it is just serious. No good TV series should be so absolutely serious. There should always be some small room for laughter, even when the series is absolutely about a great problem, a great drama evolving. Take again Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. You had character like Londo Mollari and others. Has been some time, I don't remember the name very well, like Londo Mollari and other characters who have been sometimes very tragic, sometimes very grim, sometimes even evil, but other times you just laughed with them or about them. And the same was with Deep Space Nine. You had characters like the bickering between Quark and Odo, which was going on, which was something cheerful, something, okay, there is the big war, there is the great drama, there are people dying, there's ships being destroyed, there are entire planet being evaporated, but there are moments when you just have a moment, okay, now it's just a cheerful laugh. And this balance between these two elements having a little bit laugh and having a moment where you really think, oh my god, those people died, something like that, is what makes a series interesting, and for me makes a series keep going. And if this new series, Star Trek Discovery, just totally is devoid of these humorous elements. And this is something strangely also to Star Wars, the new movies, where I think problematic. I mean, they tried in The Force Awakens to bring some elements of humor, but for me it wasn't really working. It was so overwhelmingly bleak and dark. But especially now with Star Trek Discovery, that is so untrekish in so many. They should have made more it like a special anthology, like saying, okay, we are creating a regular Star Trek series with all the elements a Star Trek series have, but in this case, this Discovery is a special anthology on the background of a running other normal Star Trek series. We make the special branching out of one particular special story, which is interesting and from a different angle than the regular stuff. Then people would have been much more willing to accept this drastic change in all these many aspects. And every change in itself, or most changes in itself, could be justified. Maybe with the example of the grotesque change of the Klingons. That is something I really don't understand, why they had to change the Klingons that much. It just does not make sense for me. But these and a few details give or taken, I could have accepted changes. But they're bringing so many changes at once that it is just too much for me. It is just too radical a turn in one big move. And especially if you had Enterprise, which was essentially a flop, and the last series, which was mostly successful, was Voyager, which was really a long time ago. The first thing you do is bring people more into a comfort zone. You don't toss them into the wild, into the chaos, into the making everything new with an all new series after such a long time. It's just not what you do. They could have made this as an extra series branching off from a regular main Star Trek series. I heard some rumors they will try to, or they are developing, I don't know, a more regular Star Trek series. They have announced it, or there was rumor about this, but I don't know if that is true. So I still hope that we're going to see someday a more regular Star Trek series again. But as back to Discovery, some final verdict. I am interested in Star Trek Discovery, and I am way more interested in Star Trek Discovery than the Orville. I have ceased, my interest in the Orville has ceased. It is just such a childish, I don't know what to look into in the Orville. It just doesn't interest me. It is too much retro vintage TV and too much sort of humor which I just don't find funny. So I will, with all likeliness, not continue to watch the Orville. But I am, especially after the final clues of episode 3, I am very fixed to see where the story with Star Trek Discovery is going on. One final word to say, because it has been brought up by some people. The social justice warrior element. Now, we know that the creation of the series had strong social justice warrior elements in mind. That some of the developers said that the Klingons are like the Trump supporters. Some official people have said that. That was the idea. And we know that this was a purpose, that the lead characters are all non-white female characters. And some can find this offensive or disturbing, and it certainly is a trend which I neither support nor I find positive. Because my idea of an integrated society would be that we come to a normal setup of characters. We don't select characters based on, oh, is this a black character? Is this a woman? But we create stories based on the idea, is this an interesting character? I am really split over the fact how much they were led by this social justice warrior agenda, and it is certainly not something I think belongs to Star Trek. While Star Trek always had this liberal lefty perspective, Star Trek was always something for people of all political directions to watch. The old Star Trek series, you could watch them as a lefty, as a person from the right, as a conservative, as a libertarian, as a liberal. No matter what your political background was, you could watch Star Trek, the original series. You could watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and of course Next Generation. They had some political hints, but Star Trek was never political. It was more general views which were transported, and it was a future where everyone was getting along and were not agendas were pushed. I'm not seeing so far that in the storytelling they're pushing agendas, and that is why I can accept it. So they're not pushing some social justice warrior agenda through the story yet. It may come at some point, I don't know, but it is not so dominating that I really feel I cannot watch Star Trek Discovery. I have the ability to ignore these elements which made them cast all female in the lead and made them suggest like the Klingons are supposed to be Trump supporters. I don't know, but I can watch it and just take it as the fantasy setting or the science fiction setting as it is, and not see these things. If I wouldn't know, I wouldn't have come to the conclusion just out of my own. Maybe I am naive in these things, but I just don't see that as a big problem, personally speaking. I am usually very skeptical when social justice warrior messages are forced into me, but it is not how I felt, seriously, having watched these 3 episodes. I didn't feel like being exposed to social justice warrior propaganda. Maybe I'm too certain in my own views that it does not influence me that much. I don't know. So, in final words, I generally like Star Trek Discovery. I think it is a series worth watching, and it is a very interesting premise. If we take away those first 2 episodes, which are really for many reasons problematic, and if we take into account that they're trying to make something different and say, okay, we have sort of a mystery series where there's one big mystery which both the people watching it and the one character through which eyes we see the things ongoing, which are gradually revealed. This is an unusual setup for a Star Trek series, but it can work if they make it interesting. So I'm not going any ratings or notes for the series which has just started, but I have overall, especially after the episode 3, a positive, interested view on the series, and let's see where they're leading us. So I can only say, have a good weekend, and of course, live long and prosper.